The day Nellie Carver drove 3 iron-fence stakes into the sun-baked earth along Redrock Creek, she knew the Dunmore Ranch would send men before the week was out, and she intended to be standing right there when they arrived. It was the spring of 1878, deep in the New Mexico Territory, where the land rolled in great amber waves between the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the east and the wide emptiness of the Jornada del Muerto to the south. The territory was still raw and unfinished, still the kind of place where a man with enough cattle and enough nerve could draw his own borders and dare the world to argue. Harlan Dunmore was exactly that kind of man, and for the past 2 years since Thomas Carver had died of fever, he had been making quiet, persistent moves to absorb the Carver homestead the way a river absorbs a small tributary slowly, inevitably, and without apology. Nellie was 31 years old, brown-haired and straight-backed, with hands that had learned to do everything a man's hands could do and then some. She had been born in Ohio, had come west at 19 with Thomas, had buried 2 children before their 3rd birthday and 1 husband at the age of 29, and she had not once in those years considered giving up the 140 acres that she and Thomas had proved up on with their sweat and stubbornness. The land was hers. It was hers by deed, recorded at the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, and it was hers by the deeper law of everything she had poured into it. The creek was the issue. Redrock Creek cut down from the mountains in a thin, bright thread and crossed the northwest corner of her property for a distance of roughly 3 feet of bank on either side before it continued onto Dunmore land. 3 feet. That was all. But those 3 feet fed the irrigation channel that Thomas had dug in their 2nd year, and without that channel the kitchen garden and the small orchard of apple and peach trees would die, and without the orchard and the garden Nellie and her 8-year-old daughter Clara would not survive a 2nd winter alone. Dunmore had erected a log dam upstream the previous fall, diverting the creek entirely onto his pasture land. He had done it quietly, over 2 days when Nellie was in the town of Mescalin buying flour and lamp oil. By the time she returned, the channel was already running dry. She had ridden to his main house, a sprawling adobe structure with a wide wooden porch, and she had stood at his door and told him plainly that the creek crossed her property first and that she had the legal right to her share of the water. Dunmore had listened with his thick arms folded and his foreman, a lean man named Cobb, standing at his shoulder, and then he had smiled the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes and said that the dam was on his land and he would do with his land as he pleased, and that the creek, as it came to her property, was barely a trickle even in good years, and she was welcome to whatever mud remained. That had been 6 months ago. Since then Nellie had written 2 letters to the Territorial Land Office and received 1 form reply acknowledging receipt of her correspondence. She had spoken to the county sheriff, a decent enough man named Holt who told her honestly that Dunmore had friends in the territorial legislature, and that pushing the matter might cause her more trouble than it was worth. She had consulted the only lawyer in Mescalin, an elderly man named Patterson who agreed she had a legitimate claim under territorial water law, but warned her that litigation against Dunmore would cost money she did not have in time that would outpace her savings. So she had decided to act on her own terms. The fence stakes were symbolic more than anything. She had gone to the creek bed, which was now only a thin seep through the gravel where the full flow had once run, and she had hammered 3 stakes into the bank on her side and tied red surveyor's ribbon between them, marking plainly where her property line ran. It was a declaration. It said, "I know what is mine, and I am not moving." She was on her knees tightening the wire around the 2nd stake when she heard hoofbeats on the trail behind her. She stood, wiping her hands on her canvas work dress, and turned to find not a Dunmore rider but a single man on a pale buckskin horse. He was lean through the shoulders and long in the leg, with a sun-darkened face and dark eyes that took in the stakes, the ribbon, and Nellie herself with a slow and deliberate kind of attention. He wore working clothes rather than anything fancy, a faded blue shirt, worn leather chaps, a battered hat with the brim shaped down on one side where he apparently rested it against his saddle. He had a bedroll and a canvas pack behind his saddle, and the look of a man who had been riding for some days. He stopped the horse at a respectful distance and touched his hat. "Morning, ma'am. I am not meaning to intrude. I saw the ribbon and wanted to make sure I wasn't crossing onto a surveyed claim." "You are not," Nellie said, studying him. "The claim is north of here. I am marking the water boundary." He looked at the creek, at the thin seep in the gravel, and then back at her. "This is Redrock Creek. What is left of it? Dunmore dammed it 6 months ago." Something moved across the man's face. Not quite surprise, but a kind of resigned recognition, as if he had heard this kind of story before. He swung down from the horse with an easy motion and let the reins hang loose. The buckskin dropped its head immediately to graze on the sparse grass, which told Nellie the horse was well trained, and the man was patient enough to let it rest without tying it. "Samuel Thatcher," he said, extending his hand. She shook it. "Nellie Carver. You live on the Carver place, northwest side of the mesa. You know it. I came through 3 years ago. Spoke with your husband about watering my horses at the trough near the barn." He paused, and something gentled in his expression. "I heard he passed. I am sorry for it." "Thank you," she said, in the way she had learned to say it that kept her voice steady. He looked at the stakes again. "You aiming to fight Dunmore over this?" "I am aiming to establish what is already legally mine," she said. "Whether Dunmore wants to call that a fight is his business." Samuel Thatcher was quiet for a moment. He crouched beside the creek bed and picked up a handful of the gravel, rubbing it between his fingers the way a man does when he is thinking hard. The morning sun was coming strong from the east, and it put a bright line along the damp gravel where the thin seep still moved, barely enough to fill a cup but moving nonetheless, which meant the spring source was still alive and the dam had not completely killed the flow. "I know water law in this territory," he said finally. "Spent 2 years working for a survey company out of Santa Fe before I went back to cattle work. Prior appropriation doctrine applies here. If you can show your husband filed a water claim before Dunmore built anything on that creek, Dunmore has no legal ground to cut your supply." Nellie stared at him. "I have the original deed. It mentions the creek as a water source." "A deed mention might not be specific enough. You would need a recorded water claim or testimony that the use was established first." He stood, brushing the gravel from his fingers. "Do you have either?" "I have a letter from a man named Briggs in Santa Fe who helped Thomas file the original homestead papers. He would know what was recorded. Then that is where I would start." He was looking at her steadily, not with pity, which she appreciated, but with the kind of direct seriousness that suggested he thought the matter worth taking seriously. "Can I ask what you plan to do about the dam in the meantime? Because Dunmore will have men out here when he sees those stakes." "I know it," she said. "I plan to be here." He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite admiration but was close to it, the kind of look a person gets when they witness someone doing something genuinely difficult without flinching from it. "What brings you through this part of the territory?" She asked because the question needed asking and because she was curious about him in a way she had not been curious about anyone in a long time. "Looking for work," he said. "I was riding for the Holt spread over in Colfax County, but the herd went to Colorado and the job went with it. I heard there were outfits hiring down this way." "Not many that aren't Dunmore outfits," she said. He nodded slowly. "That is generally how it goes with big operations. They crowd everything else out." He looked at the horizon, at the Dunmore Range stretching south and west in a great brown sweep. "How many head do you run?" 42, she said. "Thomas built the herd to 60, but I had to sell 18 after he died to cover the debts. I have 42, the orchard, the kitchen garden, and a lease on the south pasture from old Virgil Hawks, who is 80 years old and not interested in running cattle himself." "That is a working operation," he said. "More than most single widows manage." "I am not most widows," she said, and did not say it with any heat, just as a plain statement of fact, the way she would state the acreage or the depth of the well. He almost smiled. It was barely a thing, just a slight movement at the corner of his mouth, but she noticed it. "No, ma'am," he said. "I can see that." They stood there for a moment in the warm spring morning with the thin creek seeping between them and the red ribbon fluttering on the stakes, and Nellie felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the sense that she was not entirely alone in whatever was coming next. She did not know this man. He might ride on this afternoon and she might never see him again. But the feeling was there, and it surprised her. "I could use help," she said, and it cost her something to say it because she had spent 2 years being ferociously self-sufficient as a matter of survival, not charity. "I cannot pay much, but I have a bunkhouse with a sound roof and 3 meals and $20 a month if the work is steady." He did not jump at it, which she respected. He considered it, looking at the homestead visible a quarter-mile to the south, at the small barn and the adobe house and the young orchard trees. "What kind of work?" "Everything that needs doing. Fencing. Cattle. The spring planting is behind. The south pasture fence needs repair. And apparently I am about to have trouble with the Dunmore outfit, so someone who knows which end of a dispute to stand on would be useful." He was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his reins and turned the buckskin toward the homestead. "I will need to get my gear settled and see to the horse." It was not a yes exactly, but it was not a no, and he was walking toward her homestead, so she took it as the former and walked beside him. His name, she learned over the following days, came with a history that was straightforward and unelaborate. Samuel Thatcher had grown up in Missouri, come west at 20, had done cattle work and survey work, and one difficult winter of freighting between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. He was 34 years old. He had never been married, which she might have found suspicious in another man, but in him seemed to be simply a product of a life that had kept moving. He was not a man who talked much, but when he talked it was worth hearing, and he listened with a genuine attentiveness that Thomas had also had, which was a quality Nellie had always valued above most others. By his 3rd day on the Carver place, he had repaired 40 yards of the south pasture fence, had restrung the gate that had been sagging since December, and had identified a problem with the windmill's gear mechanism that he fixed with a piece of salvaged metal and 3 hours of patient work. Clara watched him from a careful distance at first, the way children watch strangers when they have learned that strangers sometimes mean change. By the 4th day she was talking to him while he worked, a stream of 8-year-old observations about the horses, the chickens, a particular rock she had found that she believed contained a fossil. He examined the rock with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and told her it was definitely a fossil, some kind of ancient marine creature, which caused Clara to spend the rest of the day trying to find another one, and to announce at dinner that when she was grown, she intended to be a scientist who studied rocks. "Geologist," Samuel said. "That is what they are called." Clara repeated the word twice carefully, and then said she intended to be a geologist. Nellie watched him help her daughter find a word for herself and felt something warm and aching move through her chest, something that was not grief exactly but was in the same neighborhood as grief, close to it, the way joy and sorrow live near each other in the human heart. The Dunmore riders came on the 5th day. There were 3 of them, Cobb in the lead with 2 younger men behind him, who had the look of men who had been told to appear imposing and were trying their best. They rode up to the creek in mid-morning while Nellie was checking the fence stakes and Samuel was repairing the irrigation channel further downstream. Cobb looked at the stakes and the ribbon with contempt. "Mrs. Carver, Mr. Dunmore says to tell you this is his water and these stakes are on his land." "These stakes are on my land," Nellie said. "They are marked by the survey line that appears on the original deed filed in Santa Fe. Mr. Dunmore's deed says different. Then Mr. Dunmore's deed is wrong." Cobb's eyes moved to Samuel, who had walked up from the irrigation channel and was standing a few yards to Nellie's right with his hands loose at his sides and his expression calm and unrevealing. "Who is this?" "My hired hand," Nellie said. "Samuel Thatcher. Cobb studied Samuel for a moment with the flat appraisal men use when they are trying to calculate whether the situation has changed. Thatcher, I have heard of you. Survey work over in Colfax. Among other things, Samuel said. Then you know this creek runs to Dunmore by law of use and development. I know the prior appropriation doctrine, Samuel said, and his voice was even and clear, carrying no particular weight of threat, just the weight of knowledge. And I know the Carver homestead claim predates any Dunmore water improvement on this creek by 3 years. The use was established first. That is the law. A silence settled over the morning. A meadowlark called somewhere in the distance. One of the younger riders shifted his horse slightly. You are saying she is right, Cobb said. I am saying she is right, Samuel said. It was as simple as that, 4 words. And Nellie felt them like something solid being placed under her feet at a moment when the ground had been uncertain, felt them with a warmth that spread from somewhere below her breastbone outward. She had been told by the sheriff, by the lawyer, by 2 of her neighbors, that she was probably right, but it was not worth the trouble. Samuel Thatcher looked at a man who worked for the most powerful outfit in the territory and said 4 words without hesitation or apology. Cobb looked between them for a long moment. Then he turned his horse. Mr. Dunmore will be wanting to speak to you personally, he said to Nellie. Mr. Dunmore knows where I live, she said. The 3 riders went back the way they had come. In the silence that followed, Nellie looked at Samuel and found him already looking at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment because the moment did not need words, and then he said quietly, We should write to that man in Santa Fe today. The one who helped with the original filing. Briggs, she said. Yes, today. She wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table while Clara slept and Samuel sat on the porch with his coffee. And through the open window she could see the shape of him against the darkening sky, the long line of his back, the stillness of him, and she thought that whatever came next, she was glad he was here. The reply from Briggs in Santa Fe took 12 days, which was faster than she had expected given the territorial post. When it came, it was 3 pages of careful handwriting that confirmed what Samuel had suspected. Thomas Carver had indeed filed a water appropriation claim in 1873, 2 years before Dunmore had any recorded improvement on Redrock Creek. Briggs included a certified copy of the filing, and a note saying he would be willing to testify in any legal proceeding if his expenses were covered. Nellie read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then set it down and pressed her hands flat on the table and let out a long, slow breath. Samuel had been watching her from across the table. Good news, he said, reading her face. Very good news. She looked up at him. We have the filing, dated 1873. Dunmore built his dam in 1877. He nodded, and there was something in his eyes that looked like relief, a personal kind of relief, as though the outcome mattered to him beyond the professional. You need to get that to a lawyer who is not afraid of Dunmore. Patterson in town is afraid of him, she said. There is a man in Las Vegas who handles territorial water cases. I heard about him from a man I worked with in the survey office. His name is Alderman, Edgar Alderman. He has won 2 water cases against large operators. Las Vegas is 4 days' ride. It is, he said. I could take the documents if you trust me with them, or we could go together if you can arrange for someone to watch Clara and the animals. She considered. Her nearest neighbor, a woman named Dora Finch who ran a small farm 2 miles east, had offered more than once to help in whatever way she could. Clara adored Dora. The cattle could graze for 4 days without much management if the gate was secured properly. I will speak to Dora tomorrow, she said. He looked at her steadily. You are sure you want to make this fight? Dunmore will not take it quietly once a lawyer is involved. Dunmore already took it as quietly as he could while he starved my orchard, she said. My apple trees have 3 good years left in them if they get water. Without water they have 3 months. I have nothing to lose by fighting and everything to lose by not. Something in Samuel's expression shifted, something that went past admiration into something more personal and harder to name. He had spent 2 weeks on this place now. He had seen her work from first light to last. He had watched her explain to Clara, with patience and without catastrophizing, that they were in a difficult situation, but that it was a situation that could be overcome. He had watched her manage 42 head of cattle, 3 acres of kitchen garden, a half-wild mare, and a disputed water right without complaint or self-pity, and he had found himself thinking about her at odd moments, in the early morning while he was doing chores, in the evening while he sat on the porch, in the way that a person thinks about something that has begun to matter to them without their full permission. He was not a man who acted on feelings quickly. He had lived long enough to know that feelings needed time to prove themselves. But he was also not a man who pretended feelings did not exist, and so he was aware, sitting across the kitchen table from Nellie Carver in the lamplight, that what he felt for her was moving in a clear direction, and that the direction was not casual. They left for Las Vegas 3 days later, after Dora Finch came to stay with Clara and the animals, and after Samuel had arranged the grazing so the herd would be manageable in his absence. The ride to Las Vegas was 4 days each way across country that was beautiful in the way that the New Mexico territory was always beautiful, meaning it was harsh and enormous and occasionally breathtaking, with the mountains on the eastern horizon and the dry plains rolling out west, and the sky above so blue and deep that looking straight up into it could make a person feel dizzy with scale. They talked as they rode, the way people talk on long journeys when there is nothing else to do but the talking itself. Samuel told her about Missouri, about his father who had been a school teacher and his mother who had been a woman of great practical intelligence and very little patience for impracticality. He told her about the 2 years of survey work, about walking land nobody had walked before with a theodolite and a notebook, measuring the earth as if it could be contained in numbers. He said it was the most interesting work he had done but also the loneliest, because the survey teams moved constantly and never stayed anywhere long enough to know it. Nellie told him about Ohio, about coming west with Thomas full of optimism that had been challenged and changed but never entirely broken. She told him about Thomas with the honesty of a woman who had grieved her husband completely and come through the other side, which meant she spoke of his good qualities and his failures both, because she had learned that grief was not served by making the dead into saints, and that loving someone clearly was more respectful than loving them blindly. He was a good man, she said on the second evening, when they had camped beside a dry arroyo and the fire was burning low and the stars were coming out in their thousands. Was sometimes stubborn in ways that made things harder, and he was not always the best businessman, but he was kind and he was honest and he loved this land the way I love it, and that is not a small thing. No, Samuel said, looking at the fire, it is not a small thing. Do you want land? She asked. Your own place. He was quiet for a moment. I have wanted it and not wanted it at different times, he said. A place is only as good as what you bring to it and what you have beside you. I have not always had the right combination. She looked at him across the fire, at the firelight on his face, and thought that he was a deeply careful man. Not cautious in the way that came from fear, but careful in the way that came from knowing what mattered. What would the right combination look like? She asked. He looked up from the fire and met her eyes, and the look held for a moment longer than any of their previous exchanges, and then he said, I'm beginning to have a clearer sense of it. She looked back at the fire and said nothing, but something had changed in the air between them, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved to disturb it. Edgar Alderman in Las Vegas was a compact, energetic man in his mid-40s with ink-stained fingers, and an office crammed with legal books that looked well-read rather than decorative. He examined the water filing from 1873 with the kind of attention that made Nellie feel he was genuinely engaged with the problem, not simply performing interest. This is a strong case, he said, setting the certified copy down. The prior appropriation doctrine is clear. Your husband filed in 1873. Dunmore's improvements came later. The dam is an illegal interference with a prior established water right. Can we force him to remove it? Nellie asked. A territorial court can order it. The question is timing. These things can take 6 months to a year if Dunmore contests vigorously, and a man with his resources will contest. What does it cost? He named a figure. It was not ruinous, but it was more than she had in savings. She felt the number settle on her and calculated quietly. I can pay half now and the remainder from next summer's cattle sales, she said. Alderman looked at her and then at Samuel. You are willing to take that arrangement? I believe this woman's case, Samuel said. She will pay what she says she will pay. Alderman nodded slowly. Very well. I will need depositions from any witnesses to the original creek use. Anyone who saw the Carver operation drawing from this creek before 1875 would help. Virgil Hawkes, Nellie said immediately. He has leased me his south pasture for 3 years. He knew Thomas. He saw the irrigation channel being used. Get me a written statement from him, Alderman said, signed and dated, and the letter from Briggs in Santa Fe. I will file an injunction against the dam within the month. She stood and shook his hand. Mr. Alderman, I appreciate this. He looked at her with a kind of collegial respect. Mrs. Carver, the law in this territory has been used against small operators long enough. It is satisfying to use it the other way for once. On the ride home, something between Nellie and Samuel had loosened in a way that was both comfortable and charged. The way a loosened rope is both more free and more present than a tight one. They talked more easily, laughed occasionally, which was new, and rode closer together without quite acknowledging it. On the third morning, crossing a shallow stream, her mare stumbled slightly and Samuel was beside her immediately, his hand on her arm, steadying her, and then his hand stayed there a moment after the steadying was necessary, warm against her sleeve, and she looked at him and he looked at her, and then they both looked ahead at the trail and continued riding. But the warmth of his hand stayed with her for the rest of the day. They arrived back at the homestead in the late afternoon of the 4th day to find Clara waiting on the porch with Dora, and a quantity of information she needed to transmit immediately about the behavior of the horses, a new fossil she had found, and the fact that one of the hens had hatched 4 chicks. Samuel listened to all of it with patient attention, and went to look at the chicks while Nellie settled up with Dora and got Clara into the house for supper, and watching him crouch down to look seriously at 4 small yellow chicks with her daughter, Nellie felt something she had been feeling in smaller doses since that first morning at the creek stakes expand in her chest until it filled her up completely. She recognized it. She had felt it before, at 19, when Thomas Carver had walked across a church hall in Ohio and asked if he could sit beside her. The recognition was both comforting and alarming, because she was 31 and she had learned enough by now to know that this particular feeling was not a small thing to step into. She went inside and started supper and thought about it while she stirred the pot. Alderman filed the injunction within 3 weeks. A copy arrived at the Dunmore Ranch the same day it arrived at Nellie's door, which was how legal service worked in the territory. Both parties received notice simultaneously. Nellie read hers at the kitchen table and felt a quiet, fierce satisfaction that she kept entirely to herself. The injunction required Dunmore to appear before the Territorial District Court in Santa Fe within 60 days to answer the water rights complaint. It also contained a temporary order prohibiting any further modification to the creek or its tributaries pending the hearing. The next morning, Dunmore himself rode up to the homestead. He was a large man, 50s, with the particular authority of someone who had never for a long time been told he could not have what he wanted. He rode a good horse and wore a good coat, and he came alone, which surprised Nellie, and then she wondered if the aloneness was itself a statement, a communication that he considered this a private matter between large interests and small, that Cobb and the riders were unnecessary because he did not view her as a genuine threat even now. She came out of the barn when she heard him and stood in the yard with her arms crossed, squinting in the morning light. "Mrs. Carver," he said from horseback, "I think we should settle this without courts." "You had 2 years to settle it without courts," she said. "You chose to build a dam. I built that dam on my land with my money and my labor. You built it upstream of a prior water claim and you knew it, she said. His jaw tightened. I will pay you $500 for the deed to this place. It is a fair price, better than fair. It is not for sale. 700, not for sale. He looked at her with the kind of look that men like him kept in reserve for moments when they wanted to make someone feel small. Mrs. Carver, a territorial court case is not a thing you want to be involved in. It will take months. It will cost money you do not have. It will put you in rooms full of men who have been at this business a great deal longer than you have. I have a good lawyer, she said. Alderman. He said the name flatly. He wins some, he loses some. So does everyone, but I have the original water filing and you do not, and that is the law. Samuel came out of the barn at that moment, wiping his hands on a rag, and stopped when he saw Dunmore. The two men regarded each other across the yard. Thatcher, Dunmore said, you are still here. I work here, Samuel said. Dunmore looked at him for a long moment. There is work at the Dunmore Ranch if you want it, better pay than whatever she is giving you. I am satisfied with my current employment, Samuel said. Dunmore looked between them with an expression that was calculating and also, Nellie thought, slightly surprised, as if the combination of a widow with a lawyer and a hired hand who would not be bought was an arrangement he had not fully anticipated. I will see you in Santa Fe then, he said. We will be there, Nellie said. He turned his horse and rode, and Nellie and Samuel stood in the yard and watched him go. And when he was out of sight, Nellie let out the breath she had been holding, and Samuel looked at her sideways. $700, he said. He thought I would take it. Men like that always think that, Samuel said. They cannot imagine someone valuing land more than money because they have always had both. She looked at him. You turned down a better-paying job. I did, he said. Why? He met her eyes. Because I believe the right thing is worth standing by, because I said she was right and I meant it, and because he stopped and something moved through his expression that was honest and careful at the same time, because I would rather be here. She held his gaze for a moment. Samuel, she said quietly. Nellie, he said just as quietly. They stood 6 feet apart in the yard on a May morning in 1878 and did not close the distance, not yet, because they were both careful people who had learned that timing matters. But something was named in that exchange of names, something real and present, and they both knew it. The weeks between the injunction filing and the Santa Fe hearing were some of the most productive and also some of the strangest of Nellie's adult life. Productive because with Samuel working the place consistently, things she had let slide for 2 years out of sheer exhaustion got done. The barn roof was repatched. The orchard trees were properly pruned. A new section of irrigation channel was dug in anticipation of the water being restored, and the cattle were in better condition than they had been since before Thomas died. Strange because she was living in close proximity to a man who mattered to her in a way that grew daily, and who she could feel mattered to her in a way he had not yet fully said out loud. And the tension of that unspoken thing was not unpleasant, but it was present in every room and every conversation, and every morning when they met at the breakfast table. Clara had no such tension. Clara had simply and completely accepted Samuel's presence in the way that children accept things that feel right to them, without ceremony or analysis. She saved rocks for him. She described her geological theories at length at the supper table. She had taken to saying good night to him when she went to bed, and he always replied with gravity and genuine warmth, and the sight of it did things to Nellie's composure that she managed to keep internal. One evening, about 3 weeks before the Santa Fe hearing, Nellie was sitting on the porch after Clara was in bed, watching the last light go off the mountains. Samuel came and sat beside her, not across from her, beside her, closer than he usually sat, and they were quiet together for a while in the way they had learned to be comfortable in silence. I need to tell you something, he said. She turned to look at him. His face in the fading light was serious and honest. Tell me, she said. I have been thinking about what happens after Santa Fe, he said. If the court rules in your favor, and I believe they will, you will have your water back and your place secure. You will not need a hired hand as urgently as you do now. You are thinking of leaving, she said, and she heard the flatness in her own voice. No, he said, and he turned to look at her fully. I am thinking about asking to stay, differently, not as a hired hand. Her heart was going with a deliberateness that she was acutely aware of. What way would differently be? He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him choosing his words with the care he brought to everything important. I am not a man who says things to fill silence, he said, so I will say what I actually mean. I came through this place 3 years ago and met your husband at a watering trough and thought he was a man with a good life and good land and a fortunate situation. When I came back this spring, I found that the good life and good land were still here, but the man was gone, and the situation was not fortunate at all. And I thought I would help with a fence and a water dispute and move on. He paused. I have not moved on. No, she said. I find I do not want to, he said. I find that I think about this place as mine in a way that has nothing to do with property and everything to do with the people in it. You and Clara, particularly you. He stopped again, and something flickered in his expression that was not quite uncertainty, but was close to it. The particular openness of a man who is saying something that cannot be taken back. I am aware that you are a widow who has managed extraordinary things alone for 2 years, and you do not need someone to manage them for you. I am not offering to manage them. I am asking if you would consider letting me be a part of them, in a permanent way. The mountains were turning purple now against the dark blue sky. A coyote called somewhere to the south, one long note and then quiet. Nellie looked at this man beside her, this careful and honest man who had stood in a yard, and told Harlan Dunmore's foreman that she was right without a moment's hesitation, who had repaired her fence, and listened to her daughter's theories, and turned down a better job because he would rather be here, who had ridden 4 days to Las Vegas and 4 days back, and said across a campfire that he was beginning to have a clearer sense of what the right combination would look like. I have been thinking about it too, she said. About what happens after, about what I want it to look like. She looked at her hands in her lap. I loved my husband. That is a real and true thing, and it does not go away. But I am 31 years old and I have a great deal of living yet to do, and I have found that doing it alone is possible, but it is not what I would choose. What would you choose? He asked quietly. She looked at him. I would choose someone who stands by what is right when it costs something to stand there. I would choose someone who looks at a child's rock as if it genuinely matters. I would choose someone who makes me feel that things that seem impossible are only difficult. She paused. I would choose you, Samuel, if you are asking. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, not in the urgent way of someone making a claim, but in the gentle and deliberate way of someone who understood what they were holding. Her hand in his felt, correct in a way that made her chest ache with its simplicity. I am asking, he said. They sat on the porch for a long time after that, talking more and talking less, and eventually the stars came out in the full sweep of the New Mexico sky, and they were still there, his hand over hers on the arm of the chair, watching them. The journey to Santa Fe for the territorial court hearing took 3 days. They left Clara with Dora again, which Clara accepted philosophically after being promised a letter describing everything that happened. Alderman had written to say the hearing was scheduled for Tuesday the 11th of June, and that they should arrive by Monday to prepare their presentation. Santa Fe was a city by territorial standards. Old adobe buildings and newer frame construction mixed along unpaved streets, with the old plaza at its center, and the territorial government offices arranged around it. Nellie had been twice before with Thomas, but the city felt different when you were coming to fight in it, sharper, more consequential. Alderman met them at their boarding house the evening before the hearing. He went through the case carefully. The water filing of 1873 was the foundation. Briggs's certified copy and his written statement affirming the filing were supporting evidence. Virgil Hawk's written statement about observing the creek irrigation in regular use before 1875 was corroborating testimony. Samuel would provide an expert statement about the prior appropriation doctrine as it applied to territorial water law, drawing on his survey company experience. Dunmore will argue that the creek use was not substantial or consistent, Alderman said. His lawyer will try to pick apart the documentation. Hold to the facts. The filing date is not disputable. The law is clear. Nellie nodded. She was wearing her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had brought in case there were formal proceedings, and sitting in the boarding house parlor with the lamplight steady and Alderman's papers arranged on the table, she felt the full weight of what the next morning meant. Samuel was sitting beside her, not ostentatiously close but close, and he reached under the table and briefly covered her hand with his and then removed it, a private and uncomplicated gesture of solidarity, and she felt steadier for it. The Territorial District Court occupied a low adobe building near the plaza. The hearing room smelled of candle wax and old paper and leather, and it was smaller than Nellie had expected, a rectangular room with a high ceiling and a judge's bench along one end. Judge Warren was a gray-haired man with reading spectacles and a reputation, Alderman had told her, for taking water law seriously. Dunmore sat at the opposite table with his lawyer, a well-dressed man from Albuquerque named Perry, and did not look at Nellie when she entered. The hearing lasted most of the day. Perry was good at his work. He argued that the 1873 water filing was improperly categorized, that the creek use had not been consistent, and that Dunmore's investment in his operation represented a greater public benefit than a small homestead claim. He used phrases like efficiency of use and territorial development in a way that made Nellie's irrigation channel sound like a minor inconvenience to the greater progress of the territory. Alderman was better. He walked through the prior appropriation doctrine methodically, placed the certified filing document before the judge, introduced Briggs's statement and Hawk's statement, and then called Samuel to give his expert account of how territorial water law was applied in practice by the survey company where he had worked. Samuel spoke clearly and without embellishment, citing the specific provisions of the territorial code, and when Perry attempted to challenge his expertise, Samuel answered every question precisely and without defensiveness. Judge Warren asked questions that suggested he had read the filed documents carefully. He asked about the physical nature of the dam, the distance between the dam site and the Carver property line, and the documented date of the water appropriation. Alderman answered each one. At the end of the afternoon, Judge Warren set his papers down and looked over his spectacles at both tables. The law in this territory on the matter of prior appropriation is not ambiguous, he said. First in time, first in right. The Carver homestead filed a water appropriation claim in 1873. The Dunmore Operations Dam was constructed in 1877. The interference with the prior established water right is a clear violation of territorial code. I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. He paused, letting that settle. I am ordering the Dunmore operation to remove or modify the dam within 45 days so as to restore the natural flow of Redrock Creek to the Carver property at the volume consistent with pre-dam levels. Any future modification of the creek that affects the Carver prior appropriation will be subject to immediate contempt proceedings. The room was quiet for a moment. Nellie sat very still. Furthermore, Judge Warren continued, I am awarding court costs to the plaintiff to be paid by the defendant within 30 days. He banged his gavel and the hearing was over. Nellie sat at the plaintiff's table for a moment after the room began to move around her, after Alderman began gathering his papers and Perry leaned in to speak to Dunmore, after the bailiff opened the back door. She sat very still and felt the enormity of what had just happened, the small private enormity of 3 feet of creek restored. Samuel was beside her. He said nothing, just sat there, And then he put his hand on her arm and she turned to look at him, and his eyes were warm and steady and carrying something in them that she recognized completely because she felt it herself. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She pressed her lips together and did not cry, because she had not cried in a courtroom or in front of Dunmore or anywhere public in 2 years, and she was not starting now. But when they were outside on the street with the late afternoon sun on the old adobe walls, she stopped walking and put both hands over her face for a moment and breathed. Just breathed. And Samuel stood beside her with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder and let her have the moment. Then she lowered her hands and straightened and looked at him. "Clara is going to be very pleased about the creek," she said. He smiled, a real full smile this time, and it changed his whole face, and Nellie thought that it was a genuinely beautiful thing to see. "She is going to want to dam it herself and study the water insects," he said. Nellie laughed, which surprised her, a genuine laugh, free and warm. "She absolutely will." They celebrated that evening with aldermen at a restaurant near the plaza, eating a better meal than Nellie had had in months, and she found herself relaxed and glad in a way that felt unfamiliar for its completeness, the way you feel when something that has been pressing on you for a long time is finally lifted. Alderman raised his glass of wine. "To prior appropriation," he said. "To 3 feet of creek," Samuel said. "To the most important 3 feet in the territory," Nellie said, and they drank. The ride home was easy in the way that rides are easy when the news you are carrying is good. They talked about the orchard, which would need a full season of proper watering to recover. They talked about the herd, and whether next spring Nellie might bring it back to 60 head now that the operation was secure. They talked about Virgil Hawkes, whose written statement had been a small act of courage from an old man who knew exactly what it meant to support a claim against Dunmore in this territory. And Nellie resolved to bring him something from her kitchen when they got back as a gesture of thanks. On the second evening of the ride home, they camped in a hollow near a stand of cottonwood trees, and after supper Samuel took 2 pieces of thin wire from his pack and fashioned something small and patient with his hands while the fire burned down, and when he was done, he held it out to her. It was a tiny figure of a bird, a rough but recognizable bird made of twisted wire, wings outstretched. "What is this?" she said, taking it. "A meadowlark," he said. "You had one singing the morning Cobb came to the creek. You looked at it while he was talking. I noticed." She stared at the small wire bird in her palm and felt something break open gently in her chest. "You made this from memory." "I have been turning it over in my mind for a few weeks," he said simply. She closed her fingers around it. It was not a diamond ring or a grand gesture. It was a man who had noticed a small thing about her and had turned it into something he could give her, and it meant more to her than anything extravagant could have. "Samuel," she said, and the word was full of things that were not yet words. He looked at her across the dying fire. "When we get back," he said, "I would like to speak to you properly about the future, about a permanent arrangement. I want to do it properly, not at a campfire, but I want you to know it is coming so that you can think on it." "I have been thinking on it," she said. "I told you so." "You told me you would choose me," he said. "I want to ask you properly." She smiled at him, a slow and genuine smile. "Then I will wait for you to ask properly," she said. He nodded, and there was a warmth in his eyes that the firelight could not account for, and they sat there in the New Mexico evening while the cottonwood leaves moved in the night wind and the first stars came out. When they arrived home on the afternoon of the 4th day, Clara ran out of the house and across the yard and stopped in front of both of them with her hands clasped in front of her, vibrating with the effort of containing her information until she had assessed the situation. "Did you win?" she demanded. "We won," Nellie said. Clara threw herself at her mother with a force that nearly knocked Nellie over, and then she detached and turned to Samuel with an expression of large and complicated feeling. "Mr. Samuel," she said formally, "Mama told me you said she was right. Did you say that?" "I did," he said. Clara considered this for a moment with the gravity of 8 years old. "Good," she said, and then she went back to the house to relay the information to Dora. and Nellie and Samuel looked at each other over Clara's retreating back, and Nellie felt laughter and love in equal amounts and could not entirely tell where one ended and the other began. Dora Finch received the news with a fist pressed to her sternum and tears in her eyes, and then she made everyone coffee and sat at Nellie's kitchen table and listened to the full account of the hearing, while Clara added details and corrections at intervals. Dora looked at Samuel with an expression that Nellie recognized as an older woman deciding something, and then she nodded to herself in a small, satisfied way that told Nellie her neighbor had already arrived at a conclusion that Nellie had not yet publicly confirmed. After Dora went home and Clara was settled, Nellie walked out to the orchard in the long evening light. The apple trees were struggling, their leaves small and pale from 2 seasons of reduced water, but they were alive. 3 of them had new growth at the tips of the young branches, small tight curls of green that said, "Still here, still trying." The peach trees were worse, 2 of them looking like they might not come back even with water restored, but 4 were still green at their cores. She put her hand on the rough bark of the largest apple tree, the first one Thomas had planted, and stood there for a while. She heard Samuel's footsteps on the dry ground behind her and felt rather than heard him stop a few feet away. "Thomas planted these himself," she said. "He was not a natural farmer. He struggled with it, but he read every book he could find on orcharding, and he sent away for the root stock, and he planted them himself, and he was so proud of them." "They are going to come back," Samuel said quietly. "The root systems are deep enough. One good watered season and they will recover." "I know it," she said. "I believe it." She turned and found him standing in the evening light with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that was the most unguarded she had seen him in 6 weeks of close proximity, open and serious and something more. "You said you would ask properly," she said. "I said that," he agreed. "This seems like a proper enough place," she said. "This orchard." He looked at the trees around them, at the evening light coming through the pale leaves, at the dry ground that was about to get water again. "It does," he said. "Nellie, I'm not a man of great means or eloquence. I have a horse and a good saddle and some savings that would buy a modest addition to an existing operation. I have skills that are useful on this kind of land. I have no family obligations that would compete with this place or with you and Clara." He looked at her directly. "I am asking you to marry me, not because you need someone to manage your affairs, because you have proven beyond any reasonable doubt that you can manage them yourself, but because I want to spend my life on this land and with you in it, and because I think we would make something good together, something better than either of us makes separately. If you will have me." She looked at him for a long, clear moment in the evening light and thought that she had heard a marriage proposal before, at 19 in Ohio, and it had been earnest and sweet and right for who she was then. This proposal was something different. It was a proposal from a man who had looked at her fully and wanted specifically what he saw, not an idea of her but the actual her, the woman who hammered stakes into the bank of a disputed creek and wrote letters to Santa Fe and rode 4 days to see a lawyer and stood in a yard and turned down $700 because the land was not for sale. "Yes, Samuel," she said, "I will marry you." He closed the distance between them in 2 steps and took both her hands in his, and then he did something that surprised her with its gentleness. He raised her hands and pressed his lips against the backs of her fingers, and she felt the warmth of it through her whole body. Then he looked up at her and they were very close, close enough that she could see the particular brown-black of his eyes in the evening light, and she leaned forward the small remaining distance and kissed him, simply and clearly, and he kissed her back with a care and a warmth that made her certain she was making the right decision. They stood in the apple orchard in the last light of a June evening in New Mexico territory, and it was enough. It was exactly enough. Clara was informed the next morning at breakfast. Nellie had thought carefully about how to tell her, what words to use, how to give her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. Thomas had been her father. 8 years old was old enough to have genuine grief and genuine feelings about the shape of the family she lived in. She sat Clara down and explained it simply, that she and Samuel cared for each other very much, and that if it was acceptable to Clara, they were going to get married and Samuel would live with them permanently and be part of their family. Clara listened to this with her most serious expression, which involved a particular set of her jaw that reminded Nellie of Thomas. Then she said, would he still be Mr. Samuel or would he be something else? What would you like him to be? Nellie asked. Clara thought about it for a moment. I would like him to be the way he already is, she said, but also staying. Nellie's throat tightened. Yes, she said, exactly that. Okay, Clara said and reached for her biscuit. Samuel was outside on the porch and had heard none of this, and when Clara went out to report to him about the fossil she had found while they were away, Nellie sat at the kitchen table for a moment alone and pressed her hands flat on the wood and let herself feel all of it. The relief and the love and the complex grief and the complex joy, all of it at once, without trying to separate it into neat categories. Then she got up and started the day. They were married 6 weeks later in the late July of 1878 in the small church in Mescalin, a ceremony that was brief and sincere, and attended by Dora Finch, Virgil Hawkes, who came in his good suit, and cried quietly through the whole thing, the preacher and his wife, and 2 of Nellie's neighboring ranchers who had watched the water rights case with great personal interest and considerable satisfaction. Nellie wore her blue wool dress, which she had added a white collar to. Samuel wore a clean white shirt and a black coat he had bought from the general store in Mescalin the previous week. Clara wore a dress Dora had helped her make and carried a handful of wildflowers she had gathered herself from the creek bank, the bank that now had water moving along it again in a proper bright thread after Dunmore had complied with the court order and modified the dam. The creek was running again. That was its own ceremony, separate from but parallel to the one at the church. The morning the water had come back, 3 weeks after the court order, Nellie had gone out at first light and stood at the bank and watched the water find its old path again, threading through the gravel, filling the first reaches of the irrigation channel, moving with the patient certainty of water that knows where it is going. She had stood there until the sun was fully up, and then she had gone inside and made breakfast, and did not tell anyone how long she had been there. The wedding supper was at the homestead, which Dora and 2 other women had spent the previous day turning into something festive with borrowed tablecloths and cut flowers, and a quantity of food that exceeded any occasion the kitchen had hosted in recent memory. Virgil Hawkes said grace with a trembling voice, and managed to work in a reference to the water rights case that made everyone laugh. Samuel stood at the end of the supper table with his wife beside him, and thought that the word wife was one he had never expected to use about his own life, and that it fit the reality with a precision that surprised him. That night, with Clara asleep and the house quiet and the moon coming through the bedroom window in a long white bar, he lay beside Nellie in the dark and listened to the distant sound of the creek and thought about all the accidents and choices that had brought him to this particular night in this particular place, and felt something that he recognized as peace, deep and genuine and unfamiliar in its completeness. She was awake beside him. He knew her breathing. "Are you thinking?" he asked. "Always," she said. "About what?" "About how strange it is," she said, "that 3 feet of creek changed everything." He considered that. 3 feet of creek and 1 cowboy, he said. She laughed softly. "Yes," she said, "that too." He reached across and found her hand in the dark and held it. They lay there with the creek sound and the moonlight and the weight of the life they were beginning, and eventually they slept. The months that followed were the work of building a shared life, which is to say they were sometimes difficult and sometimes extraordinary and mostly ordinary in the best possible way. Samuel handled the heavier cattle work and the fence management, and the repairs that required 2 people reliably to do what had been requiring 1 person and twice the time. Nellie managed the financial accounts and the planting and the household, and made decisions about the operation with a confidence that had not been diminished by 2 hard years, but had been deepened by them. The orchard recovered, as Samuel had predicted. By the following spring, with the creek running full and the irrigation channel doing its work, the apple trees had new growth that made Nellie catch her breath the morning she first noticed it. She stood in the orchard for a long time looking at the green on the old branches and then went and found Samuel mending tack in the barn. "The trees," she said. He looked up. "Come and see," she said. He set down the tack and came, and they stood together in the orchard in the April morning and looked at the new leaves coming on the trees that had nearly died, and neither of them said anything, because it was a thing that did not need words, and they had both become expert at knowing the difference. Dunmore kept his distance after the court ruling. He was not a man who forgave, but he was a practical man, and the territorial courts had made the situation clear enough that contesting it further would cost him more than accepting it. Cobb rode past the homestead occasionally and always looked straight ahead when he did. Nellie neither sought confrontation nor avoided it, which was her general policy, and the boundary held. The cattle herd grew. By the autumn of 1879, Nellie had it back to 58 head, nearly the 60 that Thomas had built it to, and Samuel had his eye on a bull from a ranch in Colfax County that would improve the herd's condition over the next few years if they could manage the purchase. Virgil Hawkes died in the winter of 1879, peacefully in his sleep, at the age of 81. He left a simple will that gave his land, the south pasture and his small house, to Nellie, whom he described in the will as the most determined woman he had met in his long life, which included his mother, which he wanted the record to note was an exceptional comparison. Nellie read the will in Patterson's office in Mescalin and sat quietly for a moment with the document in her hands. Then she thanked Patterson and walked out into the winter street and stood there, feeling the weight of this old man's faith in her, the particular and generous faith of someone who had known her, and decided she deserved what he had worked for. She told Samuel that evening. He listened, and then he said quietly, "He knew what he was giving and he gave it to you on purpose." "I know it," she said. "What will you do with the land?" She had already been thinking about it. "Keep the pasture lease as it is, carry it as part of the operation. The house I might let out to someone who needs it. There is a family over in the eastern part of the county, the Morales family, who are looking for a place to rent. Decent people, hard workers." She paused. "It is what Virgil would have liked, I think, the land being used by people who need it." Samuel looked at her with an expression that carried both affection and recognition. "Yes," he said, "it is what he would have liked." The Morales family moved into Virgil's house in the spring of 1880, a couple named Raphael and Conception, and their 3 children. They were from the southern part of the territory originally, a family who had found themselves edged off their previous land by an arrangement that was not entirely legal, and that Nellie recognized the shape of because she had nearly experienced it herself. Raphael was an excellent farmer and fixed several things on Virgil's old house in his first month that Virgil had let deteriorate in his last years. Conception and Nellie became friends with the ease of women who recognized shared competence in each other, a straightforward and practical friendship that involved the trading of seeds, recipes, child management strategies, and occasional frank conversation about the specific difficulties of life in a territory that had not finished deciding what it was going to be. This was 1880, and the New Mexico territory was changing. The railroads were coming, reaching their long iron fingers into places that had previously been accessible only by trail. Towns were growing. The territorial government was making noises about statehood, which was still years away but was a direction. The Dunmore operation, for all its present size, would eventually be hemmed in by the same forces that hemmed in all large operators as the territory filled in with more people and more law. Nellie did not take pleasure in this exactly, but she was not sorry for it either. She was thinking about all of this one evening in early 1881, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and Samuel across from her, when she said, "Clara wants to go to school in Santa Fe in 2 years." Samuel looked up from the account book he was reviewing, She told me she wants to study natural science. I think she should go, Nellie said. I think we should save for it. I agree, Samuel said. She is 9 years old, Nellie said. We have time. We have time, he agreed, and went back to the accounts, and Nellie looked at him across the table with a warmth that was by now so familiar it felt like a part of the room itself, like the light from the lamp, like the sound of the creek outside the window. She was going to have to tell him soon. She had known for 3 weeks, had been holding the knowledge privately the way you hold something fragile until you are sure you have the right grip on it. Samuel, she said. He looked up again. I think we are going to need to add to the house before next winter, she said. He looked at her carefully. He was a perceptive man. He looked at her face for a moment and then he set down his pencil. Is that so? He said, and his voice had gone quiet and particular. There is going to be someone else, she said, watching his face. By autumn, I think. He was still for a moment, and then something crossed his face that was enormous and private and real, something she had not seen before in exactly that form, something that was very much a man being offered something he had not known he was going to want until just this moment. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down beside her chair and took her hands in his, and when he looked at her his eyes were bright. Are you well? He said first, which she thought was exactly right. I am perfectly well, she said. Good, he said. Good. And then he pressed her hands to his chest and looked at her with all that enormous private feeling and said, I am going to need to add to the house. She laughed, and he laughed with her, and the sound of it went out through the lamplight and through the window and into the dark New Mexico night, over the creek that was running clear and full, over the orchard where the trees were going to bloom again in the spring, over the south pasture where the herd was sleeping in the grass that had grown thick and good with water. The boy was born in October of 1881, during the first cold snap of the autumn, in the room that Samuel had added to the house over the summer with help from Raphael Morales and 2 neighboring ranchers who came for a week with their tools and their goodwill. The room was tight and warm and properly made, with a window that looked east toward the mountains. The birth was attended by the town doctor who had ridden out the previous day as a precaution, a sensible man who had been practicing medicine in the territory for 15 years and who Nellie trusted. Dora Finch was there. Samuel waited in the main room and was, by Dora's subsequent account, the stillest and most controlled, frightened person she had ever seen, which made Nellie smile when she heard it. When Dora brought him in, the baby was wrapped in a blue blanket, a solid, dark-haired boy who had arrived with a certainty that suggested he had decided to be here and was not reconsidering. Samuel took him with the careful deliberateness of a man taking something irreplaceable, holding him in the crook of his arm and looking down at him for a long moment. He has your chin, Nellie said from the bed. I hope that is the only thing, he said, and she heard the particular roughness in his voice that meant he was feeling something very large. What shall we call him? She asked. He looked up at her. They had discussed names but had not settled. Thomas, he said, if you would like, for his father. She felt the word go through her. It was exactly right and exactly his to offer, and she had not expected it, and it caught her completely off guard in the best possible way. Thomas Samuel Thatcher, she said. He looked back at the baby. That is a good name for a person, he said quietly. Clara came in from the main room where she had been waiting with enormous and visible patience, and looked at her new brother with a scientist's eyes and her own complicated set of feelings. He is very small, she said. He will get bigger, Samuel said. How long does that take? A while, Nellie said. But you can help. Clara considered the baby for another moment and then reached out and very carefully touched the back of his hand with one finger. The baby, in the way that new babies sometimes do, closed his fingers around her one finger. Clara looked up with an expression that Nellie would remember for the rest of her life, astonished and delighted and already in love. He is holding my finger, she said. Yes, Samuel said. He knows you already. She did not think anyone would be able to sleep, given the magnitude of the day, But by the time the lamp was low and the baby was settled and Clara was in her room and Samuel was beside her, Nellie was so tired she was barely aware of it. She felt him beside her, warm and real, and she heard the creek through the window, the creek that had run dry and come back, that had started all of it, 3 feet of water that had changed the shape of her entire life. "Samuel," she said, half into the pillow. "Sleep," he said softly. "I just want to say something first." "Say it." "I am very glad you rode past that morning." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt his hand find hers in the dark for the 3rd time in what felt like a long history of his hand finding hers in the dark, which was its own kind of certainty. "So am I," he said. She slept. The years that followed were built slowly and deliberately, the way good things are built, with attention and patience and the occasional necessary revision. Thomas grew into a boy who had Samuel's seriousness and Nellie's stubbornness, and who loved the cattle with a directness that made it clear what his future would look like. Clara went to Santa Fe at 12 and then to a school that had opened in Albuquerque for young women interested in natural science, and she sent letters home full of geological observations and the names of professors and the dimensions of particular formations she had hiked to on her own determination. She came home every summer and walked the creek bank looking for fossils and told Thomas everything she had learned, while he listened with the patience of a younger sibling, who would rather be looking at the cattle, but was too polite to say so. The Carver homestead became, over the course of the 1880s, a place of genuine prosperity, not the extravagant kind that built houses with porches and hired 10 hands, but the solid and lasting kind that comes from working land well over time. The herd reached 65 by 1884. The orchard produced enough apples and peaches by 1885 that Nellie was selling a portion of the yield in mescaline, and the following year she entered an arrangement with a merchant in Santa Fe to supply dried fruit, which brought a dependable income that sat comfortable against the variable cattle market. The Morales family stayed in Virgil's house and became, over the years, as much a part of the operation as anything else, with Raphael managing the south pasture in a formal partnership arrangement that Nellie and Samuel drew up with Edgar Alderman's help in 1883. It was one of the things Nellie was most proud of, the Morales arrangement, because it was fair in a territory where fairness between Anglo settlers and Hispanic families was not always the operating principle, and she knew that Virgil Hawkes, who had seen the injustice of that situation clearly even from the distance of his years, would have approved. The Dunmore Ranch changed hands in 1886 when Harlan Dunmore died of a stroke, and his sons, who had neither their father's ruthlessness nor his energy, sold the operation in pieces over the following 2 years. The largest piece went to a cattle company out of Texas that was less interested in territorial dominance than in straightforward commerce. The political pressure that Dunmore had been able to apply through his legislative connections dissipated with him, which was its own kind of justice, quiet and impersonal and final. Nellie did not celebrate when she heard about Dunmore's death. She was not made that way. She acknowledged it privately, the way you acknowledge the end of a long-standing weather condition, and then she went back to the accounts. Samuel was the one who said quietly over supper that evening, "The dam is going to be someone else's problem now." "The dam is our victory now," Nellie said. "It has been since 1878. He looked at her across the supper table with the particular look that had been developing over 8 years of shared meals into something so familiar and warm that it was, for Nellie, the visual equivalent of the sound of the creek, part of the world as it should be. "Yes," he said, "since 1878. Thomas was eating his supper with the focused efficiency of a 7-year-old and did not look up, but he said, "What happened in 1878? "A lot of things," Samuel said. "That was before I was born." "Yes," Nellie said. "What happened?" Nellie looked at Samuel, and Samuel looked at Nellie, and some communication passed between them in the way that long-married people communicate, quick and complete. "A man tried to take this land and this water," Nellie said, "and we told him it was not his to take." Thomas considered this with the serious expression he had inherited from both parents simultaneously. "Did it work?" "We are here," Samuel said. "The creek is running. The orchard is growing." "I would say it worked." Thomas went back to his supper, apparently satisfied, and Clara, who was home for the summer and had been listening from the doorway, came in and sat down and said, "You have never told us the whole story." "You know the whole story," Nellie said. "I know pieces of it," Clara said. "I was 8. I knew about the stakes and the ribbon and the lawyer. I did not know all of it." "What do you want to know?" Samuel said. Clara looked between them with the sharp scientific eye that she had been cultivating for years. "I want to know how you decided," she said. "When you first got here, you could have gone anywhere. Why did you stay?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. He set down his fork and looked at his plate and then at Clara and then at Nellie. "I rode up to a creek bank one morning," he said, "and there was a woman driving stakes into the ground by herself, and she told me without any fuss or complaint that she was marking her water boundary against the largest ranch in the territory. And I thought, this is a person who knows what is hers and intends to keep it." He paused. "I wanted to be near that. I found I did not want to stop being near it." Clara looked at her mother. Nellie was looking at Samuel with an expression that Clara, at 17, was old enough to read completely. "And then what?" Clara said. "And then I said she was right," Samuel said, "and everything changed from there." It was 1888. The New Mexico Territory was moving toward statehood, a process that was still contentious and slow but was moving. The railroads had come close enough that the journey to Santa Fe that had once taken 3 days now took 1. There were schools and churches and a newspaper in Mescalin and a telegraph office. The world was changing around the homestead the way worlds do, accumulating into something different and taking for granted things that the previous generation had fought for. Nellie was 41. Samuel was 44. Thomas was 7 and Clara was 17, and the orchard was in its fullest production. The trees that had nearly died standing now in proper height with their branches spread wide. And in the spring when they bloomed, they could be seen from the road as a white cloud sitting above the dry hills. A thing of such unlikely beauty that people driving past sometimes stopped to look at it. On the first day of the apple harvest that October, the whole family worked together in the orchard. Samuel and Nellie and Thomas and Clara, who was home for the harvest, and the Morales children who came to help every year, and they filled crates with the fruit that the old trees gave in abundance. The fruit from the trees that had been planted by a man who had not been a natural farmer but had read every book and tried his best and poured his love into the dry ground. Nellie stood in the middle of the orchard late in the afternoon with a crate of apples at her feet and the harvest noise all around her, Clara laughing at something Raphael's eldest had said, Thomas arguing with Conception's middle boy about the best method for checking an apple for ripeness, Samuel coming toward her through the trees with sun in his eyes and an apple in his hand. He stopped beside her and held out the apple. She took it. It was perfect, deep red and firm, the kind of apple that rewards patience. "Good year," he said. "The best yet," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the October light was golden and the trees were bending with their fruit and the creek was running clear somewhere nearby, always somewhere nearby, the creek that had started everything. "Nellie," he said. "Samuel," she said. It was enough. It was always enough. They had learned over 10 years that the most important things did not require many words, only the right ones. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood in the orchard together as the afternoon light went long and amber across the hills. And around them the harvest went on, the crates being filled and carried, the voices of their children and their neighbors rising in the ordinary music of a life being lived well. The creek ran past the north corner of the property as it had always run, as it had run before Thomas Carver planted his first apple tree, and as it would run long after all of them were gone, finding its way through the gravel, patient and insistent and clear, carrying its small portion of the mountain's abundance down through the land to wherever the land needed it most. 3 feet of bank, 3 feet of water. 3 feet that had been the difference between a homestead and an abandonment, between a widow alone and a family together, between a woman who gave up what was hers and a woman who did not. It had been enough to fight for. It was enough to have won. And Samuel Thatcher, who had said she was right on a May morning in 1878 with the red ribbon fluttering on 3 iron stakes, had been right about a great many things since then. But that had been the first and in some ways the best of them, because it had changed everything that came after. All of it. Every day and every harvest and every name spoken at a kitchen table, and every hand found in the dark, and every morning beginning with the sound of the creek through the open window. Bright and steady and entirely, completely hers.